Hey guys, my name is Nick and welcome if you're new. In this video we're going to talk about 7 easy to grow, easy to find, pet safe houseplants. But before we get started with that, you might notice my wonderful botanical bro shirt that is representing my plant friend IRL Maria Fiala from Bloom and Grow Radio. If you aren't already familiar with Maria or Bloom and Grow Radio, it is a wonderful planty podcast where Maria sits down and talks planty things with planty people. It is a really lovely way to pass the time, and not only is it a lovely podcast, but I was absolutely honored to be a guest on one of the most recent episodes of her podcast. So after you're done watching this episode, you should definitely go over and check out that episode on Peperomia 101 that we discussed on her podcast, which you can find on your preferred podcast player, Spotify, iTunes, what have it. Not only that, but Maria and I did an episode on her YouTube channel where we talked about Peperomia Propagation. So you can get over there by either heading over to her channel, Bloom and Grow Radio, or you can go over to my most recent video, which was a teaser that sends you guys over to her video on her channel. So definitely be sure to check that stuff out when you're done watching this video. Speaking of peperomias, peperomias across the board are all pet safe or non-toxic. So any peperomia you bring in your home will pass the pet safe test. But one that I highly recommend that is not only easy to grow, but pretty easy to find nowadays, not so much a few years ago, but nowadays, is Peperomia argyria, or the watermelon peperomia. Now this is a very large example that I have right now. They are usually a little bit smaller than this, but I just want to show you guys the full oomph of these leaves because they are absolutely gorgeous and they really just have that really striking watermelon appearance. It's actually quite interesting how similar these look to watermelons in real life. A really easy peperomia to grow because this plant has a lot of language. So if I feel these leaves, they're really succulent and I can tell that this plant does not need water. But when this plant does need water, these leaves will lose most of that succulence. They'll become pretty flimsy, and the plant almost might become a little droopy as well. So when I find the plant in that condition, I give it some water, and it usually perks back up in a day or two. Peperomia argyria, or watermelon peperomia, is one that would definitely rot pretty easily if you overwater it. So I would definitely look for the signs before you water this plant because I would not be shocked to see this plant rot pretty quickly with just one overwatering. So it's definitely a very set and forget kind of plant. I'm probably watering mine about every 7 to 10 days, keeping in mind I keep mine in pretty bright locations. So this one right here I keep in an east-facing window, but I also have another one that I keep pulled off from a south-facing window, and actually another one that I have pulled off from a south-facing window. So I have 2 pulled off from a south-facing window, and then this one growing in an east-facing window, and so far they have been an absolute piece of cake. Our second plant that fits the criteria of not only easy to grow, easy to find, but pet safe is this lovely Pilea cadierei. So they commonly refer to this plant as an aluminum plant. And this is probably one of the most common plants that I'm sharing with you guys today. This is one that you would definitely walk into a big box store, and on most days you'd be able to find it. It's a pretty easy plant to find, and not only that, it's a very easy plant to grow. So Pilea cadierei, or aluminum plant, can really take some of the darker corners in your home. I have this one pulled back quite a few feet from my south-facing window, so although it's in a bright room, it is in a dark corner for sure. I kind of rely on the telltale signs of this plant when it needs water. So when this plant is happy, you can see the leaves are very upright, but as soon as this plant is thirsty, those leaves are going to droop, and this plant is pretty much going to look on the brink of death. But you water this plant, and within a few hours to the next day, the plant's going to pop back up and look completely normal, just like some other plants like peace lilies and phitonias that are known for looking pretty much dead and then coming back to life. As you can see, I'm kind of holding this plant up because if I let go, this plant is very wonky and has a lot of character, if you will. I have had this plant for at least a year now, so it's definitely showing me its true colors and how it grows. It's going to start off pretty small when you find them in the stores, but they will grow pretty rapidly. The brighter light you give it, the more it's going to grow most likely, but I have noticed that this plant does not want too much bright light because it will bleach the leaves. So it's best to keep this plant away from any bright windows, just as I keep this one in more of a darker corner in my home. So Pilea cadierei, a really excellent pet safe plant to try out in your home. My third selection for this video is this wonderful wax plant. It is this Hoya obovata. And while Hoya obovata might not be the easiest Hoya to locate, Hoyas in general are pretty easy to locate, so I'm sure you'll find at least a Hoya carnosa in your local plant shop, and that is quite frankly the easiest Hoya to grow. But this Hoya obovata is not far off, so I wanted to share it with you guys today. It is a really wonderful Hoya with these large round leaves, and my particular variety here I think is the splash variety, so it has these wonderful white splashes on the leaves. Hoyas like to be in a brighter spectrum of light. I'd say they like to fall between like medium and bright light, but not necessarily like bright direct sunlight that a succulent would prefer. However, there are some varieties of Hoya that do prefer some more light. The more succulent varieties like a Hoya carrii or the heartleaf Hoya would definitely prefer some brighter light, or like a Hindu rope Hoya. But this Hoya obovata definitely falls in like the middle of the spectrum, and that's kind of what I really appreciate about this Hoya. It's really low maintenance. I just kind of water it every 2 weeks or so when I notice I have not watered this Hoya in a good amount of time. So that's really how I care for this plant, and that's really how I care for many of my other Hoyas as well. Hoya obovata, Hoya pubicalyx, Hoya carnosa, those are all some really easy varieties of Hoya, not only to grow but to find depending on where you live. So I definitely recommend giving them a grow, and they also flower. Not usually when you first buy them, they usually need to get a little bit more age to them, but if you have a Hoya for a few years, it should flower for you, and the flowers are gorgeous, and some of them smell really good. Apparently some of them smell really bad too, but we will all cross that bridge when we get there. So Hoyas are a really wonderful pet safe plant to try out if you don't have one already. I've got some twins for you for number 4. So if you are a frequent flyer here on my YouTube channel, then you have heard me talk about Cissus to no end. So Cissus are related to grapes, like the grapes that we eat, so they're in the Vitaceae family. Grapes in Latin are vitis, and one of my favorite plants that I grow inside that happens to be pet safe and very easy to grow and generally easy to find. Maybe not the plant that's easiest to find on this list, but it's decently easy to find. It is called grape leaf ivy, so the name, hence it's related to grapes, makes a lot of sense that its leaves look very similar to grapes as well. So this plant also looks very similar to ivy, hence the name. So it's kind of like a combination of a grape plant and an ivy plant, and it grows in just that manner. If you are familiar with grapes in the vineyard, they vine. Ivy is a vine, so these plants are pretty much interchangeable. However, if you've heard me talk about Cissus before, the reason I love Cissus so much is because it looks so similar to ivy, which I love as a person who lives in an urban environment, but ivy is so difficult to grow and it's not pet safe. So Cissus is our wonderful replacement for ivy. Just a note, I think ivy is difficult to grow because it needs a lot of light, and it's also a magnet for pests, specifically spider mites, but I've had other pests as well, such as scale. So just something to keep in mind if you have ivy in your home. I'm not saying don't grow it, I'm just saying be wary if you're growing it in your home. But Cissus is my wonderful replacement. So not only is there the grape leaf ivy of this particular plant, which is Cissus rhombifolia, there is also Cissus rhombifolia, the oak leaf version. So I've got twins for you today. So here's the grape leaf version, here's the oak leaf. It's all in the shape of the leaf, as you can see. So this one's got more of a grape leaf shape, and this one has more of an oak leaf shape, as the names suggest. So Cissus, I give these a generally bright amount of light. I don't necessarily grow them inside a windowsill, but they would probably grow a little bit better in a windowsill. But I also don't think they would want to be fried by like a south or west facing window. They'd probably prefer an east or north facing window. But as long as you ease them into that window, I'm sure they would take very well to a west and south, as long as you do not forget to water them. This is definitely a plant, if you forget to water it, it will crisp up on you. And while it could probably recover if you cut it back, it's not a plant that would recover like the Pilea and the Peperomias that I was talking about earlier, where you wait for them to wilt. This is not the kind of plant where you want to wait for it to wilt. You definitely want to keep this plant on the moist side, maybe like 50% moist, watering the plant when it dries out, roughly 50%. Just as grapes grow in a vineyard, this is a vine, and it will attach to things with its little tendrils if you give it something to climb up. So I have had other cissus like attached to my macrame hangers, climb up the macrame hangers, attach themselves to other plants. So this is definitely a plant you got to keep an eye on, because once it gets growing, it's going to take over your home, but I highly recommend growing it. It's not an offensive take over your home. It's a very lush and dreamy take over your home. So Cissus rhombifolia, highly recommend this plant if you're looking for an easy pet safe plant to grow. My fifth selection is the ever so popular and the ever so infamous Pilea peperomioides. The UFO plant, the Chinese money plant, the friendship plant, whatever you want to call it is cool with me. But the Pilea peperomioides is an incredibly easy to grow plant as long as you have enough light. So I think the biggest issue new plant parents have when they bring this plant home is that they just put it on like a dining room table or a coffee table or a shelf expecting it to grow, but this plant really does require a good amount of light. It doesn't need like succulent cactus types of light, but it would definitely prefer being in the windowsill if you're working with a dimmer window such as a north or east facing window, or you could maybe even pull it back a foot or two from a south or west facing window. But light is definitely the most important thing when growing the Pilea peperomioides. Following water. So this plant definitely will fall apart pretty easily if you overwater it. This is another one similar to the peperomia, the watermelon peperomia that I talked about earlier, where I kind of feel the leaves and rely on the way that the leaves feel, because this is a very succulent plant and the leaves feel succulent. I know that there's water in this plant and it probably doesn't need water. So this is another one I just listen to and wait for it to feel or visibly look like it needs water. Otherwise, I find I water this plant too soon and some of these lower leaves will turn yellow and fall off. So to avoid that, that is just kind of how I care for this plant. But the more light you give this plant also, the bigger the leaves get and you'll get more babies in the pot, and overall it will just be a happier plant. So like I said, you don't necessarily want to fry the Pilea peperomioides and bake it in the sun, but it definitely would prefer more light than you would expect. Certainly a really easy to find plant nowadays. This plant used to be the most difficult plant to find and everybody wanted it, but now you can walk into pretty much any plant shop and find this plant, hopefully for a small amount of money, because it used to cost you an arm and a leg. So you can definitely find a decent sized Pilea peperomioides without breaking the bank. Next up is the imposter of the Pilea peperomioides, or perhaps it's the other way around. It is Peperomia Polypatria, which they commonly refer to as the teardrop peperomia. And you're probably going to notice right off the bat how glossy this plant is. So it is a very glossy, a very deep green plant, and very, very succulent. The succulence of this plant tells me that this plant does not require a tremendous amount of water, so I do grow this plant in pretty much the same exact conditions as I grow the Pilea peperomioides, its doppelganger. Actually, if we're going to get into a little conversation about where the names come from, Pilea peperomioides and Peperomia Polypatria, Pilea peperomioides gets its name because the suffix oides in peperomioides means it looks like. So if you read out Pilea peperomioides in Latin translated to English, it means Pilea that looks like a peperomia. And you can see what it looks like. So this is definitely one of the peperomias that Pilea peperomioides, the name, is referring to. So this plant obviously looks very similar to Pilea peperomioides, and funny enough that its care is very, very similar, if not dead on. So if you can care for Pilea peperomioides, you can certainly care for Peperomia Polypatria. Just be sure not to overwater it. Our final pet safe, easy to grow, easy to find houseplant is this wonderful and ever so lovely Calathea makoyana. Now you might be saying, but Nick, I thought this was an easy to grow plants video. Why is there a Calathea on this list, or a prayer plant in general? They are not easy to grow. I totally agree. Calatheas and prayer plants, they are not easy to grow. They're definitely difficult houseplants. However, Calathea makoyana has been my saving grace. This is legitimately the easiest prayer plant I have ever grown. It is just such a joy to grow, not only because it is so freaking beautiful, but it actually puts off new growth. This is my second one because I love it so much, and I just really enjoy the beautiful peacock pattern on the front. I think they also call it peacock plant more commonly, but the beautiful peacock-like pattern on the front versus the lovely purple on the back that almost makes it look like an entirely different plant. Now, in terms of care for Calatheas, of course they do require a little bit more maintenance, so it's best not to water your Calatheas with tap water because they do not like fluoride and some of the other additives in the water. It will cause them to get brown tips. To avoid those brown tips, you should use distilled water, rainwater, whatever you have in your house that doesn't have those added things in it. Filtered water might not cut it because it still has fluoride in it, although it is certainly better to use than tap water. So go crazy if that's what you have. Of course, 1 or 2 or probably even like 5 to 10 waterings with tap water is not going to affect the health of your plant. So in dire need, go crazy, water your plants with tap water. I will admit that I water my plants with tap water probably way more than I should. And you can see how okay this Calathea makoyana looks, so no worries when it comes to that. However, I would say another really important factor for Calatheas or prayer plants in general is to keep the humidity up. So I do keep this Calathea in a room with a humidifier. It's not so much an issue in the summertime, but it's more of an issue in the wintertime when the heat kicks on, and that will dry out our homes tremendously. So if you want to keep your Calatheas lush over the wintertime, I definitely recommend investing in a humidifier. Be sure to keep your Calatheas out of direct sunlight, and be sure to also keep them moist. You will know if you're giving your plants too much light or not enough water because their leaves will curl in and they will look kind of sad looking. So if you ever find that your leaves are curled up from the edges in, assess the situation. If your plant is still moist, it's perhaps getting too much light, but if your soil is bone dry, then you definitely need to give your plant a water, and it should recover, not right away, but it will definitely recover over the next few days. So don't be alarmed if you find that your Calathea is not looking so hot. Just give it a few days to recover, and it should do well after some R&R. Thank you all so much for tuning in today on my video on 7 easy to grow, easy to find, pet-safe houseplants. I hope this opened a few doors for those of you who have some nippy pets and you need some more easy pet-safe plants in your homes. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at phillyfoliage, and be sure to check out the podcast and the YouTube video that I did with Maria Fiella from Bloom and Grow Radio. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys next time.